Hi everyone, how are you doing? I'm Eric from Lonesome Reader, and you know what? It is getting chilly here in London, so I have my warm, snuggly jumper on, and I am ready to spend the next few months just curled up in front of the fire, reading and with a cup of hot chocolate and watching old movies and yeah, just sort of bunkering down for the winter. I've received some great books recently from publishers that are being published in the UK in November, so I wanted to share them with you and talk ones that I'm particularly excited about reading. So I'm going to start off with this non-fiction book by Elena Ferrante, which is being published by Europa Editions, called Frantumaglia. Hopefully that's how you say it. This comprises 20 years of letters and essays and interviews and meditations by Elena Ferrante, all about her passion for writing and about her life, which, as I'm sure many of you know, her actual real life has been the subject of a lot of speculation and controversy recently when an article came out sort of outing her. She's always been a very private author, and it revealed who she really is, what her life is like. But I've sort of remained out of all of this and kind of oblivious to all of this. I haven't read that article or any of the articles in response to it because I've actually shamefully never read Elena Ferrante. Sometimes I feel like I'm the only person in the world who hasn't read her books because they've been so popular, a matter of a lot of discussion, and I'm sure I'd really like them. I'm sure I'd get along with them, but I haven't read them yet. Haven't taken the time for it. Maybe this winter is the time. Although I've sort of been like perversely thinking that like maybe I should start reading about this book and reading her nonfiction and about her life and her thoughts about writing rather than getting into the novels. I thought that might be just an interesting way of doing it around. I don't know. What about you? Have you are you, any of you big Ferrante fans? What do you think about her books? And are you interested in this nonfiction book? Let me know. Next is a really beautiful looking novel called Midwinter by Fiona Melrose. This is her debut novel, and just look at the cover of this. There's a cute little fox on it and beautiful design, and I just love how it looks. And this is published by Corsair, and it's the story of a father and son who are farmers living in rural Suffolk. And the mother of the family, called Cecelia, she's died many years ago, and the father and son have never really talked about this. So it's about all that suppressed feeling and emotion, and it just gradually comes out over one winter, I think. So it's about those emotions which people aren't able to discuss in their families, because I think in a lot of our families, when there's a particularly tragic or emotional thing, sometimes we just don't discuss it and we suppress it. So I'm really interested to see how this story plays out. The storyline actually reminds me somewhat of James Kelman's novel Dirt Road, which was published a few months ago, which is also about a father and son who are grieving but for the loss of the mother of the family, but they don't really talk about it. But they go on a sort of road trip, and it's these emotions gradually come up over the process of that trip. Whereas in this book, it sounds like they sort of stay put, and the father and son go on kind of different journeys of self-discovery. So I'm really excited to sort of snuggle up and read this beautiful looking book. So when I was a teenager, I loved writing letters. I had lots and lots of pen pals all around the world. I got into this thing because a good friend of mine was really into pen pals. And there was this whole sort of like underground thing where pen pals would share each other's addresses and details. There are these things called friendship books, which got sent around in the post, and you would sort of add your name and address to it and what you were interested in, and gradually people would start writing you. And so you could develop dozens or even hundreds of pen pals all around the world this way. This was all in the pre-internet age. So it opened up all this communication from people around the world which you wouldn't have exposure to otherwise. And I was just a boy living in rural Maine and had very limited access to a sort of diverse amount of people. And I was just hungry to learn about other people's lives, other people's experiences. And I love the process of letter writing and getting letters in the mail. You know, there's a special excitement of getting something in the mail rather than something just popping up in your inbox. And I'm telling you all this because there's this special project called the Letters page, which is a website and also a regular journal that comes out, which reproduces actual letters from authors between each other, talking about their experiences, sharing stories and poems and travelogue and experiences, thoughts about literature. And it's a really special, interesting project that really tries to recapture the magic of actual hand letter writing, something which is sort of dying out as people just send each other emails because it's so much faster and cheaper. And so coming out in November is the first anthology, bringing together a lot of these letters from a whole variety of authors like George Saunders and Evie Wilde, who is a writer that I absolutely love, Kevin Barry, who a really interesting experimental Irish writer, and Joanna Walsh, who's a book of short stories, Vertigo, I read recently and really adored, really like fascinating collection. And also Naomi Alderman, who actually, I'm reading her new novel, The Power, right now. Really interesting, fantastical book all about women's empowerment. And so this anthology is coming out in a limited edition. It's looks like it's going to be really beautiful with information about the authors' lives and drawings that they've made and their actual handwriting. So you can actually see, you get a special sense of the rhythm of these authors' thought processes in their actual handwriting. You know, there's something so special and intimate about it rather than just the printed words on the page in a like Microsoft Word document. That really gives a flavor for their character and the person it's coming from. So that's going to be a really exciting, interesting volume that's coming out soon. Next, I'm going to talk about the short novel Cove by Cynan Jones. And this is being published by Granta Books, who publish so much great fiction and really interesting titles. So I've never read Cynan Jones before. I've heard a lot about his previous books and how forceful and interesting they are. So I'm really excited to give them a try. And in this book, it's about a man who's out at sea on a boat and he gets struck by lightning, which makes him lose his memory and also become physically injured. And so this book, I think, is about his journey to get back to civilization in this debilitated state, sort of like Man Against the Elements book. So it sounds like a really exciting, meditative story about this man's journey. And yeah, really excited to read it. The next book I received is called Miss Jane by Brad Watson. It's being published by Picador. And I read how the author, Brad Watson, went through 30 drafts of writing this book before he was able to come up with this finished version. And it sounds like a really interesting story. It's based on his real-life great-aunt, who was born with a genital defect, which meant that she suffered from incontinence and that she wasn't able to have children. And so she never married. So it's a story about this woman living in early 20th century in Mississippi, a rural area. And I think it's sort of about womanhood and what womanhood means, particularly at this time and place, how women were defined by their roles as a wife and mother. And so how this woman never married and questioning of what those identity roles really mean in our society. So I'm really curious and interested to read this book and how he goes about it. Next is Cousins by Sally Vickers, and this is being published by Viking, and it's a really beautiful book. I don't know if you can see, but it has this lovely gold leaf on it which shines, and on the inside cover there's a family tree. It's a really beautiful design, and it is a story told from 3 different women's perspective, all of the same family, and it's about a male family member of theirs called Will, who suffers from a really tragic accident. And I don't know what that accident is yet, but it gets their different perspectives on it, and especially how this tragedy affects their family over time. It goes all the way from the beginning of World War II into the present day. So I think it's sort of about how these incidents of family life are passed down through the decades and generations. So sounds like a really interesting story, and yeah, it doesn't hurt that it's also a really beautiful book. Next is an Irish book. I particularly love Irish fiction, and this is called Lyrebird by Cecelia Ahern, and it's been published by HarperCollins. And you can see it has this like beautiful gold border, and on the front of it, it says, "Life is in two parts: who you were before you met her, and who you are after." It's about a woman named Laura who lives a very solitary existence in rural Ireland, and apparently she has a special power. I'm not sure what that is, but I assume it might have something to do with flight or feathers from the cover of the book. And a man named Solomon finds her one day and tries to coax her to come into civilization. So he brings her to Dublin, and it's, I think, about that clash between sort of rural life and living a solitary life, and joining in an urban life, and I don't know what, I guess because of like the feathers and possibility of flight, it makes me think of Angela Carter's novel The Night Circus, which I absolutely love, which is about a woman named Fevers who was hatched from an egg, and it's just this wonderful book. And so I think this book also might have a sort of slightly kind of magical type edge, but like in a very literary, interesting type way. So I'm really curious and excited to read this book. This next book is called Bella Mia, and I'm going to massacre the author's name. I just know it. Her name is Donatella di Petratonio, and this is being published by Khaleesi Press, and it's narrated from the point of view of a woman in the aftermath of an earthquake which occurred in Italy in 2009 and took many lives. And so it's about the reconstruction both of the citizens' lives and the city around them. So it sounds like a really compelling, moving, emotional book. And it has a really striking, interesting cover, which I think sort of tells a story in itself. So I'm very curious and excited to read this novel. Next is a book and an author that I'm really excited about, Linda Grant, and her novel, The Dark Circle. I read Linda Grant's previous book, Upstairs at the Party, which was really excellent novel. And I take it that this novel is very different. It's about twins, a brother and sister who are twins, and living in the 1950s, I think, who are Londoners, and they are both diagnosed with tuberculosis, and they leave London to go to a sanitarium in a rural part of the country. And so I think it's about that contrast again between the city and the country, but also about conditions in the sanitarium at the time. Apparently, there's a sort of miracle cure being rumored coming from the US of A. I don't know why I said that. The US of A, the United States, the US, I don't know. But yes, Linda Grant's writing is really forceful and interesting, and she writes in a really compelling way about particular historical time periods and about how modes of thought and ways of thinking have like changed over time. So really intrigued to read this next novel of hers. The next book is really special. It's a book of poetry and artwork, poetry by the Nobel Prize winner Derek Walcott and the figurative artist Peter Doig. And it pairs poems with artwork to make a different kind of statement about the text and how these different forms of artwork like reflect upon each other. So I think this is a really beautifully done book. It's being published by FSG, and I think it's going to be one of those books that I'll just want to spend a lot of time with, going through very slowly, even though it's a relatively brief book. But yeah, it's because the poetry is about aging and love and just observing the world around you. And I've read some of Derek Walcott's poetry before, and it's really beautiful. So yeah, I'm interested to see how the interplay between the artwork and the poetry. The next book is a massive book, really long. It is the New Yorker book of the 60s, telling the story of a decade. And this is being published by William Heinemann. And it's a sort of collection that reflects the massive societal shifts that were occurring in that decade. You had protests on Washington, and there was the assassination of Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. There were political protests and sexual revolution, and it's a whole collection of writing from really fascinating, really famous writers like James Baldwin and Truman Capote, Calvin Trillin, who's a really interesting nonfiction writer. I've read some of his essays before. And fiction writers like John Cheever, and also poetry from Sylvia Plath and Anne Sexton. So it's a whole range of work from nonfiction and travelogue and about music and art and short stories and cinema that was coming out at the time. So it gives a whole real rounded flavor of that decade, of what it was like and the changes which were taking place in society at that time. So I think this is a book that you just want to keep for a long time and sort of dip in and out of to get a full flavor of that decade. So it's going to be a really interesting reference book to have. The next book is a very different kind of book by Anne Rice, and it is called Prince Lestat and the Realms of Atlantis. It's published by Chatto and Windus, and I was so excited to get this book because when I was a teenager, I was a massive geek. I absolutely loved reading Anne Rice, and I read all the Vampire Chronicles, and I even had a boyfriend who went by the nickname Lestat, which I think tells you a lot about him. But anyway, moving on. I was so excited to get this, and it'll be really interesting to catch up with what Lestat has been up to. Apparently, this involves the lost city of Atlantis and a ancient spirit which is taking control of his body and mind, and so wrestling with these elemental forces which have been sort of working behind the scenes, unknown to most people. And I just love how Anne Rice in her fantasy stories really challenge conventional ideas about identity and people's places in the world. So this is going to be like a big nostalgia trip for me reading this, and I sort of wonder how much I'll remember about the previous books, which I just devoured as a teenager. But it's I think it's really fun and interesting that she's still writing about these characters. So that was a big whopping pile of books. Really great books have been being sent to me recently. I'm really excited to read them all, and I'm sort of glad for the cold weather, so I'll have a lot of time inside to spend reading. So let me know below if you're also interested in reading any of these books, or what else is being published in November that you're excited about reading, or what have you been reading in general. I hope you all have been well and reading lots, and yeah, I look forward to speaking to you soon. If you want to watch more about what I've been reading, please subscribe to my channel, but in the meantime, happy reading, everyone.